Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC EduSet live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that time to time we talk on different topics and with the help of these topics we believe that we help you in studying your course material, as well as I hope that all those who are not from the particular subject or the topic still find these lectures very interesting. Dear friends, in this lecture today we are going to talk about literary criticism in Hindi phase 1. That is, we would be talking on the era. We are talking about the era when the criticism in Hindi literature begins. So dear friends, for this we have again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Prakash is a retired reader from DU, from the Department of English. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash, and I believe that the way he used to deliver his lectures with ample of examples, I hope that this session is going to be one of the productive sessions. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, for this very encouraging appreciation of what I'm going to do today in the lecture. Friends, the topic of today's lecture, as has been announced, is literary criticism in Hindi, phase 1. And as all of us know, and this has been discussed in the previous lectures also, Hindi is a very young literature. Hindi as a literature, as a writing, began in the 20th century itself, in the opening years of the 20th century, and criticism is still younger, in the sense that when people write, then they do not write for written about, for being written about. They write to communicate something to the audience. The audience may be sitting in front of them. The audience may be far away from them, situated miles and miles away, and that audience is reached through the printed word. So there are both kinds of literature, the oral literature and the written literature. We confine ourselves in this series with the written literature, and Hindi as a medium of literary writing emerged in the early 20th century. Of course, there were writers earlier too, in the preceding years, in the latter half of the 19th century. But then, as a specific, identifiable literary endeavor, Hindi writing begins with, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century. What is literary criticism, and how literary criticism helps us understand literature, is a question that the expert viewers know. They know the answer. But there may be others who would be wondering as to what criticism means in literature. And I have in mind the viewership of people who are interested genuinely in literature, but may not be aware of the implications of criticism. So let me tell friends that criticism is not actually finding fault with something in literature. Criticism means discussion. Criticism means analysis. Criticism means a kind of comment. Criticism means interpretation and explanation. So all these things that people say and do, not within the framework of writing creative literature, but outside it. They talk about it when the book has been written, when the poem has been composed, when the short story and the novels have been composed and printed. Then the function of literary criticism begins. And then what does the criticism in that sense do to literature? I have already explained partly, but then there is a kind of a thought that is inherent in every literary writing, and this thought is hidden. This thought is multi layered. This thought is not easily distinguishable from other aspects of literary writing. For instance, you are reading a short story or a novel, and you are totally immersed in what is called the concerns of the character, or you are curious about knowing what is going to happen next. and there is a very interesting situation, and you expect, you know, a particular characters caught in that situation to behave in a manner that's going to make you happy. So all these things are there, and mostly when we read literature, we do not know that indirectly and invisibly an idea is being conveyed through literature to the audience. So one function, very important function of literary criticism is to trace this idea, is to locate this idea, to separate it from the text, and then to present it for the benefit of the reader, so that, you know, when the reader has known the discipline existing in an independent form, and has made use of that discipline to understand various aspects of literature, then the reader is alert. The reader wants to know as to what the author is going to say, what the author is going to suggest, and all those things. Then, you know, literary criticism becomes of great value. So literary criticism alerts us, it makes us aware about the presence of certain things which are otherwise hidden on the surface of literary writing. So if literature in Hindi begins with the 19th century, let's say 1900 or a little before, then, you know, criticism at that point of time is not going to be there the way I explained it to you, because writing has begun, and India was a country, you know, of a large number of illiterate audience. In fact, they didn't know what literature was, except that, you know, there were stories which, you know, would tell them about certain principles of morality, certain principles of goodness, and literature would be entertainment, but literature would be something more. One has, you know, read Ramayana, one has seen Ramayana enacted on the stage, and you know, it's supposed to be a religious book, which means that whatever Ram does is supposed to be done by all the viewers, etc., and whatever Ravan does is to be shunned. So that kind of, you know, it's a religious text, but then there is a kind of you know, literary aspect in it, which you know, viewers of Ram Leela or readers of the Ramayana do not know. So, but there is an element of pleasure in Ramayana. You know, for instance, God Ram, let's say, is there as a character, and when God Ram is there in the book as a character, then this particular character will speak the language of the reader, and you know, the emotions of Ram will, you know, coincide with the emotions of the reader, and when Ram is caught in a situation, and the situation, you know, turns him into you know, a dissatisfied person, then, you know, the reader's own sense of dissatisfaction will you know, emerge in the process of watching or reading Ramayana, and that's how, you know, the religious text will turn into a literary text. It will be of interest to the reader, not from the point of view of knowing what religion would expect, but from the point of view of knowing what Ram as a human being will do, you know, in the text itself. So these fine areas which are outside Ramayana, which are outside the literary work, it is these you know, which interest the critic, and this kind of a tradition didn't exist in India. There weren't literary critics, you know, in the 19th century, for instance, people whose job was to read literature as experts and to tell the viewers, to tell the readers, you know, that this is what literature, particular literary text means to him or her who interpreted it, and this is what it should mean for the audience. So that tradition of discussing literature was not there in India. It was not there, you know, in the form in which it emerged later. So, so far as literary criticism is concerned, then this is the phase, you know, which we have to concentrate upon, and try to understand as to what made people at that point of time to, you know, ask questions of curiosity about the message, the idea of, you know, representation in a literary work at that time. And initially, well, there will be no expert critic in Hindi and in other languages in India, because Indian languages were coming into their own as, you know, as humanist texts, as texts, you know, which would talk about the you know, issues that ordinary masses, the ordinary readers would face in real life. So that kind of writing would emerge somewhere in the wake of the nationalist movement, and that movement starts in the latter half of the 19th century, and it comes into its own in the 20th century. So along with that, people now start writing in a different vein, in a different manner. And then these writers who write, sometimes they want to talk about their own activity. So Premchand is writing short stories, but sometimes he would write an essay and tell as to what he means by a particular short story, and by the very practice of writing short stories. And in Bangla, I think readers are more lucky in the sense that they have great modern writers in the 19th century itself. I suggest just two names for your consideration: Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and Rabindranath Tagore, and both of them are modern writers, and they pick up their plots in their fiction from ordinary situations in the village, in the small town, in the city, whatever at that point of time attracts them. So they pick it up and then depict that scene and the characters caught in it in their works. And when they are not writing, when they are not thinking about writing anything further, then they exchange letters and they meet other writers and then they discuss. Now I put this question to you, and I put this question to myself as to what writers discuss when they meet with fellow writers, and somebody has written, and this person has brought a copy of the literary work, let's say a poem, and the poem is recited in a company of friends who are writers. What will the writers discuss then? This is the question. And my answer would be that whatever they discuss, whatever they point out, whatever they emphasize, that thing would be literary criticism in the seed form. So that's how literary criticism emerges in Hindi also. That writers start talking to one another. They start writing letters to one another. They write letters to editors. Editors write back to them, showing their dissatisfaction or satisfaction, appreciation or criticism, etc. And this kind of an exchange of views and responses actually is moving in the direction of, sooner or later, what I call criticism. Now, because this very practice of discussing literature is as recent as the 20th century, or at the most the century and a half. So let me see that the first seeds of literary criticism in North India are found in the letters of Ghalib, the letters that he wrote to his friends at that time. And sometimes he would attach a ghazal to his letter when he wrote, and the friend would answer back and say something about the ghazal, and Ghalib would say, no, sorry, you have not understood what I meant. Now this is the situation, this is what I have said, and in that situation this is what the line means. So he starts explaining in the letters. And the second thing that Ghalib does, and this is very important for us to understand, Ghalib is an Urdu writer, but he is also a Hindi writer. Hindi and Urdu are there in the 19th century as languages, which could be called Rekhta or Khadi Boli, and one can't distinguish as to what is Hindi and what is Urdu in the 19th century. So Ghalib starts writing a kind of prose which is not the conventional letter, but which is a prose that he is addressing himself to, or is addressing it to his friends. And there, since he is discussing literature, so there you have the seeds of literary criticism. Now, the scene changes after Ghalib. Ghalib dies in the 1860s. I think 1869 he dies, and that is the period of turmoil and tumult in India. You know that 1857 had happened, and people are not happy at all, particularly in North India. And the supposed mutiny was talked about all over India, in South India, in the western part of India, and people were not happy. And when they were not happy, and they were also at the same time writing, then lots of newspapers would have emerged, and they did emerge. In fact, there were social reform movements. There was educational activity. Certain schools and colleges were opened in the latter half of the 19th century. And the number of education institutions multiplied, and very big organizations running the activity of education, they came forward. people started collecting money through donations, etc., and made it their mission to spread education. And this way, a kind of abstract thought, a kind of abstract prose emerged. And if there are papers and magazines, then you would like to make the content of the magazines interesting. So poems were written and short stories were written, and then there would be letters to writers there. And in those letters, some poem or something, some short story would be discussed. And this way, literary criticism began in Hindi. So I would say that 1900 is the year when people would be thinking of discussing literature, writing about it. I have in mind an essay that Premchand himself wrote about an Urdu poet, a contemporary Urdu poet. And this essay that Premchand wrote, I think runs into 15 or 20 pages. And point by point, Premchand, as an editor, as a writer, as a thinker, is interpreting somebody's poems. This is Akbar Allahabadi's poetry that I refer to. So there is a whole article by Premchand written on Akbar Allahabadi's poetry, and in that poetry, what Premchand says is not important. What is important is that he is discussing the the poetry, the poems of Akbar Allahabadi. So this is what I think is literary criticism, and this begins around the time that I mentioned, and then the practice goes on. So you have literary criticism in the early part of the 20th century itself, and the names of people who emerge, which emerge in Hindi criticism. One of the first names is of a gentleman called Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi, and he's a great editor. He edited Saraswati at that point of time, and he ran discussions in the pages of Saraswati. And he invited writers to participate in the discussions, and he also published paper articles, analytical articles and comments on the writing of the period, and that's how formally literary criticism came into being. So this is the process, and well, I'm confining myself to the 1900s, and then the second decade of the 20th century, and then the third decade, and in these 30 years. A lot of activity happens around the writing that is taking place at that time. So, for instance, in the 1920s and 30s, there will be a series of articles on poetry written by that famous Hindi poet called Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, and he is not happy with the way Pant is writing, Sumitranandan Pant is writing, and therefore he takes up his poems individually and he starts commenting on them in an article, a series of articles in Madhuri. At that point of time, and that is proper actual criticism. Now, one of the jobs at that time of the phase, this is the first phase, when literary thought emerges in Hindi, and writers themselves are participating. Like Premchand is writing on an Urdu poet, Nirala is talking on a fellow Hindi poet. And when they say something, then other parties, other lobbies, other groups also become active. They want to answer back if a critical remark is made, or they are happy if an appreciative remark is made. And this kind of an activity becomes quite important and independent of literary writing, in the sense that then they start talking about literature among themselves. So these 30 years are very fertile in so far as giving rise to literary debates and discussions is concerned. So this is the first point I make, and I say that somebody has to define then what is Hindi writing. Somebody has to define when Hindi writing began. I for instance begin with the latter half of the 19th century, so far as Hindi writing is supposed to begin. Now some people may doubt my very understanding of Hindi writing, and would say no, Hindi writing began in the 18th century, and you can find examples that there are poets who write in Hindi. It may not be called Hindi at that point of time, and there are other languages which are very close to Hindi, and later on these languages will contribute. You can call them dialect if you like. These dialects will contribute to the growth of Hindi, etc. So some people say that the writing in the dialects of Hindi would be also Hindi writing. If somebody argues like this, then Hindi writing begins not in the 19th century or the 20th century, then it begins in the 18th and 17th centuries. Then somebody can say also that, well, no, Hindi exists, in the poetry of Kabir also. Kabir and Meera, maybe Meera is using Rajasthani words, but that Rajasthani of Meera is very close to Hindi. So it's not the 17th century, but before that, when Meera is writing or Kabir is writing, still before, and somebody can go back to Amir Khusro, who wrote, in a language that we still understand today. Therefore, this discussion about when Hindi writing began takes us to when Hindi writing actually originated. So imagine the 20th century is also taken up with issues of this kind. When does Hindi writing begin to emerge as an independent, medium of literary expression? And the question is posed in such a manner that people then start discussing, they start in fact reading more. They might search for books at that time which would talk about the 18th century, 17th century, etc. Somebody then for instance can raise the question, what are the connections and links between a particular period and the writer who lived in that period? So talk about the connections. So in that case, literary criticism moves out of the domain of the literary work itself, because people are talking then about literary writers and their time. So how does time influence or press upon or puts the writer in conflict with one's time? All these questions become important for the understanding of literature. In that case, literary criticism starts involving this particular aspect also. So how does one resolve this problem in Hindi criticism as to when Hindi writing began? This is the question that is being posed in the 1920 and around this time. And I can as I am chatting about this, let me tell you that people would like to then find out the exact sources that contributed to the origin and growth of Hindi writing. And my question then would be, why are they asking this question? They never asked these questions in the 19th century. They never asked these questions in the 18th century and before. Kabir never asked the question as to when Hindi emerged. He didn't even discuss the language at all. He might have referred to Hindi or Urdu, not Urdu at that time, or Braj or Punjabi or all these things. He might have mentioned some words here and there, but he would not discuss it. Why does a writer, a thinker, a learner of writing in the 20th century raises this question is important? And well, you can think about it. Geetika, what do you suggest? Why is this question raised in the early 20th century? If somebody has to ask you, it's a difficult question, I know, yes, but you can venture some kind of an answer.
It's a difficult question, as you yourself said that there was a bit of a confusion if we take in the present context, because it was the Hindi also, and with Hindi also other languages were also emerging, and I would say there was a bunch of languages due to which there might be little confusion and difficult to ask this question.
That's true. And for instance, Braj is there. Braj is very close to Hindi. In fact, there are writers in the 19th century who write poetry in Braj, and plays. For instance, I am talking of Bhartendu Harishchandra, and writing plays in Khadi Boli. So there are two languages that the same writer is using for two different forms of literature. For plays, the Khadi Boli prose, and for poetry, the Braj Bhasha. Tulsidas is supposed to be a Hindi writer, so Tulsidas would be writing sometime in the 16th century, in a language which is not Hindi at all. It's Avadhi or well, it has elements of Bhojpuri and all those things. So Tulsidas would be that, then would he be called a Hindi writer? So these questions start emerging in the 20th century, and my answer to this question is, because well, I've done some kind of thinking about this. My answer is that this is the need of the national movement in the 20th century. The national movement wants to tell themselves as well as the world, in general, that Hindi is an independent literature, Indian literature is an independent entity all by itself, and that it has a history, and that history should be traced. So we trace the history of the Indian writing, you trace the history of Hindi writing, Urdu writing, etc. And in 1920s, this question is posed by the academics also, because schools and colleges have opened and they have started, learning and teaching Hindi as a medium of instruction as well as, a medium of literary expression. So in both cases, somebody is going to raise the question, when did Hindi emerge and what is the history of Hindi literature? And very soon a writer in Hindi emerges to answer this question, and he answers this question by writing actually the history of literature, history of English literature, and this person's name is Ramchandra Shukla. He writes his history of literature. It is called Hindi Sahitya Ka Itihas, and this is one of the first attempts by any person to write a comprehensive history of Hindi literature in the 1920s. I think the book was published in 1926 or 7, and it goes into closely printed 600 pages, around that that number of pages, and it traces the origins of Hindi in the 10th or 11th century. When Sanskrit loses control over expression, and people start expressing themselves in ordinary languages of different parts of the country, ordinary regions, and when they start writing epics in the the non-Sanskrit languages in India, unestablished language in India, and Ramchandra Shukla would say that is the time when people assert their literary expression through a language which they speak, and that should then be traced back to this period, and then you can talk about the specific writers. And it's a great work, and I don't think that this work has been excelled even today, because Ramchandra Shukla himself was not a professional critic or a professional scholar of literature. He learnt all tricks of the trade on his own as an individual practice, and he became a proper writer of the history of literature, and he is considered a model of writing the history of literature at this time. And he also after this went into the process of discussing specific poets and works, and for instance, it is he who very, very clearly stated that the best example of Hindi writing is found in Tulsidas, and then he goes into it, and then he also raises the question of what is poetry. So there is a whole chapter, there is a whole essay. The essay would be, I think, I forget the number of pages, but it must be around 40 pages. In that essay, he talks about kavita kya hai, what is poetry, and it's very difficult to answer that question at that point of time. And Ramchandra Shukla had read European criticism also, because some of the ideas that he's expressing in his essays are coming from Western critics and thinkers, and therefore he's using them, but he's giving them his own coloring from the experience that he has, etc. And that's how a proper criticism of Hindi emerges in the 1920s and 30s. And Ramchandra Shukla is supposed to be then the father of Hindi criticism, and even today, it is his history of literature that is in the course of most university departments, and you cannot do without referring to him. Is there something you'd like to say about Ramchandra Shukla, etc.? No. Okay. Now, Ramchandra Shukla also became a teacher. Ramchandra Shukla, started discussing literature as an activity, that will take Hindi criticism forward, and a kind of debate occurred in Ramchandra Shukla's time, and I want to refer to this as something which will help us understand the nature of criticism. For instance, Ramchandra Shukla, as a true scholar, a genuine thinker, took a position on certain aspects of writing. For instance, he would say that poets should be properly read, properly educated. They should have been to a school. They should have learnt languages. They should have studied languages, etc. And when it comes down to Kabir, who never went to a school, who never touched a paper or pen, and who merely spoke, and what he spoke was dohas and or the songs, the bhajans, the padas, etc. And all that he said was later on compiled by different people. And when Ramchandra Shukla would consider Kabir, he would say he is not a poet, or he is a poet whose interests are very limited, and he is illiterate, and he is uncultured, and he writes like a Muslim. He doesn't write like a Hindu. Now, using this terminology doesn't mean that Ramchandra Shukla is belittling any particular section of society, but then he has some kind of prejudice in the 1920s and 30s. That Kabir is not a kind of poet who should be read with seriousness. And his argument appears to be somewhat communal to the secular minds of today. But he says this, and then he also criticizes Kabir for being harsh in his comments on religions. Not that Ramchandra Shukla believes in any particular part of religion, but then he would say that Kabir is not qualified to talk about Shastras, which he is criticizing. He says this very clearly in his in this Sahityika Itihas, and his example of good poetry then is the poetry which he himself called Lok Mangal. Lok Mangal means the interest of the masses, the interest of the ordinary folk. And the moment the Lok Mangal word comes in, then the idea of morality is there. So he would say that great literature is that literature, genuine literature is that literature, genuine poetry is that poetry which talks about the moral principles that will bind the society together. So he will talk about what in Hindi is called samanjasya. That is, people get together, they remain together, and there should be a kind of harmony. Of course, there are conflicts, he says, but those conflicts have to be resolved. So in a way, he is giving a chance to the writer to think about this question of the function of literature. And his best example is Tulsidas, whom he interprets as a poet who will establish samanjasya, some kind of harmony. Now, viewers, would you agree that literature's job is to get people together under a certain perspective, and that perspective is moral? So, Urushi, I think, Geetika, this is what you can discuss. You can ask whether literature's job is to spread a sense of harmony and morality, or whether literature's job is to create a sense of pleasure. This is the question that suppose I pose this question, then how would you answer?
So actually what you said in the lecture itself, when you word the word samanjasya, so samanjasya jab hum baat karte hain, when we talk about it, it is a balance. So I feel that a sense of morality and harmony should be there.
True, very true. But then you have an example of another poet to whom I referred, and that example is of Kabir, who didn't talk about samanjasya, who talked about criticism, who talked about setting people right. He said that people were befooling themselves. They were fooling themselves when they belong to one particular sect of faith. And in Kabir's opinion, the purpose of human beings is to become more and more self-aware. And Kabir's poetry was very popular at that point of time. Tulsidas' poetry also was popular, but that was popular in the sense, that it talked about religion and morality. So these two strands, remained. And this very debate is the crux, is the soul of criticism. Because, in this debate, what is being suggested is that, literature has a function to perform. And that function is to spread awareness. Therefore, that function is to, tell people the value of harmony, the value of norms of life, those norms which have to be discussed and accepted, and that literature should remain by and large from conflicts, or if there are conflicts, then one should try to resolve them. So this particular and this became a big issue, because there were aesthetes in in Hindi, writing in the 17th century and 18th century. There were poets, in Hindi. Now they are accepted as a part of Hindi. There are poets like, Keshav, for instance, and poets, lived in the courts of the kings, as there were, dancers, and there were singers in the courts, singers in the under the patronage of the king. So there also would be poets, and these poets, will write, praise of the kings and their families, etc. And in Hindi there is a word called charan and bhat, and these people are supposed to sing praises of the kings and their family, and if they fought in a battle, then the acts of bravery in the battle is to be presented in a form that kings themselves appear to be godlike. So that way there were kings of the court, and the poets of the court, and these poets' job was to create only a sense of beauty. So, for instance, there is a poet called Bihari Lal. He is called Bihari also, who has written a book. Who has a book now? Now we know him by this book called Sat Sai. Sat Sai means 700. So it has 700, dohas, sort of, in the Sat Sai, and mostly Bihari is talking about Shringar. Shringar means the sense of beauty of a woman, and he celebrates the beauty of a woman, and well, he writes the kind of poetry which is very close to erotic poetry, and this body of writing, this category of writing is quite common in Hindi at that point of time. So there is a point of conflict between what Shukla is saying, Ramchandra Shukla is saying, and what other people are saying. So some people would say that the purpose of literature is to create sense of beauty, sense of pleasure. So poems should be set to music. They should be used also for dance, etc., and people should feel entertained. So one school says that they should be entertained, and Ramchandra Shukla is saying that there should be a sense of harmony, and writing literature is a very responsible act, and that responsibility, so far as he is concerned, is there in Tulsidas. So Hindi criticism actually matures in this period. So Hindi criticism is answering these questions, and some people would point out the faults in erotic poetry or poetry of beauty and poetry of Shringar, and some others would then go back to that period when scholars actually discussed literature, not in Hindi. Those scholars were there in Sanskrit, and they wrote whole treatises, independent treatises in Sanskrit, and there they talked about rasas, that literature should always create a sense of rasa. Ras means emotion, and then then they started going into the number of rasas that are there in human life, and then they categorized 9 or 10 rasas, 9 rasas particularly, and the king of all rasas is Shringar. And when this kind of aesthetics is there in Sanskrit, then aesthetics is brought either directly or indirectly into Hindi writing in the 20th century also. The important thing, the significant thing in the early 20th century is that a national movement is going on, and young people are taking part in the struggles against the British imperialists, and they are getting more and more united, and they are getting more and more educated also. They read books, they talk to people, they discuss among themselves, they evolve a perspective, and then they share that perspective with the audience, which is a part of, or which constitutes the soldiers of the national movement. So when these people are there, then writers like Premchand would straight away say, nothing doing with erotic, nothing to do with other rasas. Let's only talk about the rasa which takes us closer to the masses, and sense of dignity and freedom. So the very idea of rasas is being attacked, is under attack in the 20th century when literary criticism is happening, and therefore people start raising questions not of rasas then, not of emotions. So literature is not supposed to be exactly creator of that particular pleasure which was supposed to be the soul of writing earlier. So people should be educated through poetry, and I think I discussed in some other lecture earlier that there are poets like Maitri Sharan Gupta in Hindi, who will not talk exactly of the rasas, who will talk of education through literature. And there is a book, famous book by him called Bharat Bharati, and Bharat Bharati is supposed to tell the Indian readers, to become proud of their country, to become proud of their culture, and to fight against, those people, who hit them, who enslave their minds, who target them, for certain kind of attack. And the wave is such in the early 20th century, when the criticism emerges, that almost every writer worth the name is supposed to take part in the national movement and to talk about the interests of the masses. So these are the first 30 years. This is called the the age of the first phase of writing, when people are taking up these issues. Now I'll take up one more point, and after that I'll come to the conclusion of phase one. That the biggest concern of literature in the 20th century, because of the continuous movement of the national movement towards a kind of solidification of anti-imperialist approach, that the issue that is emerging in the process is the issue of realism, is the issue of presenting real problems of life in literature. And this is a new idea so far as Hindi writing is concerned. New idea, new critical idea. It is being pursued in novel after novel, in short story after short story. In the case of most writers, people write with a purpose, and they take up actual situations. There are actual characters. You read any important writer of the 1910s, of 1920s, etc., and you realize that people are talking about the village. They are talking about the small town. They are talking about the street. They are talking about the poor. They are talking about the peasantry, and that such a thing had never been a part of literature earlier. So the question that is emerging very clearly in the writings as well as in criticism in the 1920s are questions of realism. That the writer should be a realistic writer. The writer should try to understand the reality oneself, and the writer should try to make that understanding available in its simplest possible form, for the benefit of the reader. Now, why is it that national movement is finding literature so important? Is another question, and my answer to this is that the purpose of writing, the purpose of composing literature, and the purpose of national movement are the same. The purpose is to cater to the needs and requirements of the ordinary masses. So entertain them, but through entertainment tell them the correct ideas. And this is what great writers at that point of time, whether it's Tagore, whether it's Bankim, whether before him, or whether it's Sharichandra Chattopadhyay around the same time, whether it's Premchand in Hindi, whether Subramanyam Bharati is there in Tamil and English. So wherever these writers are, they are basically educating the masses and telling them about their role. For this reason, I say that Indian National Congress, which is the main weapon of campaign against the British, that also is now approaching the writers to write for the cause of freedom. And there are instances. I think I should tell one instance with you, that Mahatma Gandhi would sometimes be in touch with a person like Premchand, and I think I said it in another discussion also, that Gandhiji liked some of the stories of Premchand very much. One story is Panch Parameshwar, and Panch Parameshwar is a very realistic story. It's a story not directly referring to any political movement. It's not directly referring to British imperialism and things like that. It's a simple story about two friends who fight and finally make up. Finally, they become friends again. It's a story about a village, where conflicts exist. But then finally, what Premchand is saying is that if the arbiters, the panchas, from where the word panchayat occurs, if they sit in the chair of to distribute justice, to give justice to the people, then they become gods themselves. So Panch are Parameshwar, Panch are the voice of God. So this is what Premchand seems to be saying. But then he is saying many other things in the story. And these days, of course, we discuss Panch Parameshwar as a very exquisite piece of writing, because there are so many layers in it. And Gandhiji saw the message of Panch Parmeshwar, and he said, writing should be like this. You know, that you go to the masses, you tell them that this is their wisdom, that should be, you know, caught by the author, and this should be articulated in such a form as this. So what I am saying is that criticism, literary writing, politics, realism as a term which is as philosophical as it is literary, all these things are coming together and forming a kind of perspective that will be useful for the cultural life and richness of the country as a whole. And I would suggest that in the first phase, already in the first phase, you know, the phase would end somewhere around 1930, 1935. I can't specify the years. It can continue till 1940 also. The phase that starts from 1900 and goes up to 1935, 1940, etc. This is the first phase, and I say something very, very debatable. It can also be, you know, it can also start some kind of a controversy, that this is the golden phase of Hindi criticism. It is the first phase, and this is the best phase, because in this phase all these questions are the genuine questions, and it's not the experts who are thinking about it. Writers are discussing, politicians are discussing, cultural activists are discussing, educationists are discussing, and all of them have in their mind the social cause, because of which all these debates occur, and these debates are really quite important. So when the next phase occurs, then something will happen. I'll talk about that in the next lecture. But so far as this phase is concerned, generally the school is out, generally the college is out, generally the course is out. Nobody is discussing this. There are no professors of Hindi literature at that point of time, the way we understand the term today. There are no set courses. People discuss literature, etc., but literature is being discussed in the open forums. For instance, one discusses literature in a magazine, one discusses literature in a gathering, in a bigger gathering, but one discussing literature in a political campaign. So if you go and if some leader goes and talks to the writers of Varanasi, and gets them together, and there is a discussion, at that point of time, that is what the forum is. If a writer has a problem with another writer and the two cannot sort it out, and then they approach a leader at that time who knows both, then that is the forum. But the forum is not of the college or the school the way things are today. So in the first phase, let's say the platform is the platform of life. As in writing, so in literary criticism. What is there in literary writing? Writers just move around, they look at people, they discuss things with them, they take pen and paper, they express themselves, they also read out their short stories or the poems to others, and they inspire the masses. I can give the example, for instance, of a poem which I referred to in other discussions. There is a poem by Subhadra Kumari Chauhan called Jhansi Ki Rani, and in that poem, that poem can be recited in the beginning of a political meeting, in a rally. So some children can come forward and they can sing this poem, and the poem is Khoob Ladi Mardani, wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi. And Jhansi Ki Rani straight away takes the audience to the 19th century when this kind of battle was fought. Finally, Jhansi Ki Rani was killed, but then was captured. I'm getting a bit mixed up, but then the purpose is that she didn't succeed in her mission, and yet it's a poem of patriotism. It's a poem of Deshbhakti. It's a poem in which a woman has come forward, and she is not behaving in a womanly manner, a traditional, conventional womanly manner. She is a fighter. She is a soldier, and people are emulating her example. So lots of girls and women would come forward and will join the campaign just because there is an inspiring example of a queen who sheds her inhibitions of moving out of home, and she takes part in a battle which is as much cultural as it is political and military. So this kind of writing in the first phase will inspire the critics also to take recourse to a discussion which will be around social issues. And the one last thing, and then I finish, that this is also the period, and we should not miss on this. This is also the period when a large number of women, starting from Subhadra Kumari Chauhan and Mahadevi Varma, they join the mission of education. They start educating, particularly focusing upon women, and they write stuff. They write kind of literature that will give women a sense of dignity, and this particular thing is encouraged more and more by the political writers also. So you have even Mahadevi Varma not merely writing poetry but also writing her experiences, and those experiences are written not in poetry, of course. In poetry she was talking about her experiences, but she took to prose, and if you read this prose, then she is discussing certain concerns which are of direct critical concern for us. So she's reminisces. She talks about the family. She talks about the issues that girls face, and straight away you can connect it with the women's writing of the day. When the second phase, the last phase, I would call it the second and the last phase, when that begins, then people have started getting together around certain specific causes. So then what is going to happen in the 1930s is something that will generate a different kind of force in literature, and criticism is going to happen in two different directions, and those directions may clash with one another. But so far as the first phase is concerned, these groupings have not become clearly identifiable. So I can give you an example of a writer who evoked the past in the 1930s in his poetry. The example is of Jayashankar Prasad. He talked about nationalism of the conventional variety. He took up certain heroes from the past, and he put them up as great Hindu kings, people like Skandagupta and people like Chandragupta in his place. But when he came to writing novels, then he became very critical of the contemporary issues that were suppressing the masses, and therefore his novels are totally different from his poetry and from his plays. And why this kind of conflict is happening in the same person, who when he writes poetry he says one thing, when he writes a novel he says something else. His language also changes. In his poetry he is very tatsam, very Sanskritized, but when he writes prose he is very, very down to earth. So these are the questions that literary criticism started grappling with in the 1930s, and Jayashankar Prasad also wrote certain essays, and those essays talked about these things. So the point at issue that then would be that criticism has finally known its form and its role in the 1930s, and in these 30 years of journeying from let's say 1880, 1885, you can name the year yourself, it doesn't matter. For instance, the Congress Party, Indian National Congress, is established in 1885. Some people can use that date, some others can use some other date, but then the beginning years of the 19th century onwards up to 1935, a whole distance has been covered, and it has been realized that the answer is there not in the older conventional form of critical thinking, which is concerned with rasas, 9 or 10 rasas, and the rasas are the emotions, but being closely attached with, linked with reality, and that reality is to be understood, the reality is to be is to be addressed properly, and a position and a stand should be taken. So criticism has reached this level, and I think that is the zenith of critical thought in the first phase itself. In the second phase, what happens, that will be discussed in the next lecture. Thank you.
Definitely, sir. We would be discussing about the second phase in the next lecture. But if you talk about the first phase alone, as you yourself has elaborated in detail, but now the same question arises again, which I would like to put up, that we can say that the first phase has a direct connection, or it has a roots with the freedom movement also, because it was the era when the writers were talking or writing patriotic poems or the articles angles which has deep connection with the freedom movement. So can we say that yes, the phase 1 has deep roots with the freedom movement also?
Definitely, this is exactly the point. You rightly picked it up. This is the point I am making. That the first phase gets its strength, its inspiration, its value system from the national movement, which is itself about getting people together around the cause of freedom. And freedom is a value that cannot be compromised on. You have to accept freedom as the central issue of life. And people have sacrificed everything for the freedom movement at that point. That they have left their families, they have left their homes, and they are being arrested and put behind the bars, and they don't mind. And they have done all kinds of, they have gone through all kinds of suffering. But then idealism reigns supreme then, and this idealism is the core of literature too. So literature that at that point of time is looking upwards. It is looking for certain principles for which human life can be sacrificed. And when this thing enters literature, then literature also thinks big. And one very important aspect of literature is its thought. It is this thought that we have to keep in mind, because this thought gives strength through literary criticism. So literary criticism means a kind of a gritty, enthusiastic, intellectual response to writing. And when critics come forward and when they apply their minds and they sift wrong from right, bad from good, strong from weak, etc., and when they find out that writers have a role to play and that for that role they have to give their all, when criticism is inspired by this kind of value system, then it also encourages writers to take more and more issues in their hands and deal with them, grapple with them with intensity and urgency. So this is exactly the thing that I am saying.
As we always say, and we believe that a writer is a writer or a poet is a poet because he listens to his or her emotions, and then we can again say that when the writer feels for a particular thing, then it is easy for the writer to put down the things on the paper. So we can say that that era also was an era of emotions where the writer put up their things.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, emotions and thoughts cannot be separated, in that sense, because when you have emotions, when you go through some kind of a suffering, when you go into a kind of liking, etc., now that energizes you to think also more. It makes you more and more alert also. So these two things go together, and that era is such in which the writers have to say something to communicate, and they have to remind themselves again and again that they belong to a country where vast masses are illiterates. So they are writing for them, they are writing of them, and they are writing for them, and therefore their language has to be simple. So these are the issues that criticism points out as something that will be discussed seriously.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving a thought to this particular lecture, and I hope that all the students who might have watched this lecture would be benefited. Dear friends, if you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback regarding this lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would like to take your questions in the next lecture when Professor Anand Prakash visits our studio. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.